Welcome to Serenity and Fire, the podcast where wellness meets grit. I'm your host, Krista Guidenti, founder of Panacea Luxury Spa Boutique. Join me as we dive into the intriguing world of biohacking, clean living, cutting-edge spa trends, and the hustle, grind, and grit of entrepreneurship. From my personal battles with weight management, infertility, and a 30-year journey to create and launch my dream business, to building a sanctuary for those who have been touched by cancer, I'm here to share real talk, inspire big dreams, and spark a passion for holistic living inside each and every one of you. So let's dive in. Welcome back to Serenity and Fire. Have you ever wished that you could simply heal faster? Maybe you've struggled with chronic tendinitis, a rotator cuff injury that just won't heal and lingers on for months, or maybe it's plantar fasciitis that just never seems to go away, or possibly a nagging back injury or a surgery that took way longer than you expected to recover. And maybe you've heard people talking about peptides like BPC 157 or TB 500, and you thought that maybe this is a solution that can finally help me. And you found yourself wondering, are these actually healing people and making them feel better? Or are these simply wellness trends that are going to be in and out just like the last trend? Well, if your curiosity led you to the internet or to your social media feeds to explore more, you probably walked away more confused than when you started. One source calls them miracle molecules, another says they're dangerous. Some physicians prescribe them regularly, while others refuse to even touch them. Professional athletes talk about them all the time. Longevity conferences and functional medicine clinics promote them as well. And it seems like they're being discussed on literally every wellness podcast out there, including mine. But peptides just really seem to be everywhere, and it almost feels as though they appeared overnight. But the FDA has raised questions about several of them. So how is anyone supposed to know what to believe? And that's exactly why I wanted to do this series on peptides. My goal has not and is not to convince you that healing peptides are the end-all be-all. I'm also not trying to convince you that they're overhyped. But what I am hoping to do is take this seemingly very complicated topic and break it down into something much simpler. And by the end of today's conversation, I'm hoping that you'll be able to understand how to thoroughly evaluate these therapies for yourself so that you can make an educated decision about whether or not these are something for you. Plus, once you understand how to think about healing peptides in the way that I'm going to break them down today, you'll be able to better evaluate almost any emerging therapy you hear about in the future. So let's start at the beginning. Over the last 2 episodes, we built a peptide foundation. We talked about what peptides even are, and then we spent an entire episode talking about GLP-1 medications. It was a really good episode, so if you missed it, definitely go back and listen. And we've also talked about why GLP-1s have completely changed the conversation around obesity and metabolic disease. It's actually really exciting, but GLP-1 is only one peptide. Scientists have identified hundreds of naturally occurring peptides throughout the human body, and researchers continue discovering new ones and learning more about what they do. Some help regulate hormones, some influence our immune system, some affect how our brains communicate, some are being studied for longevity, some for muscle growth, some for skin health, and today we're going to be exploring an entirely different group altogether, healing peptides. These peptides are generating a lot of excitement because researchers believe they may actually influence biological processes involved in recovery, inflammation, connective tissue repair, gut health, and wound healing. Before we discuss individual peptides, though, I'd like to zoom out for just a few minutes. And let's answer the most obvious question first. What do we actually mean when we say healing peptides? Unlike GLP-1, which primarily influences appetite regulation, insulin release, and blood sugar control, healing peptides are being studied because they appear to influence biological processes involved in repairing damaged tissues. Researchers are investigating whether peptides like this can affect things like inflammation, collagen production, blood vessel formation, immune signaling, communication between cells, and the incredibly coordinated process your body uses every time it repairs itself. I chose those words very carefully because I said researchers are studying whether these peptides influence healing. I did not say that they've been proven to regenerate damaged tissues in humans. These are 2 very different statements, and I want to be very clear about that. So for the rest of this series, you're going to hear me separate 4 different types of evidence. First, biological theory. Does the mechanism actually make sense? Second, animal research. What happens in labs and animal models? Third, human clinical research. What have carefully designed studies in people actually demonstrated? And finally, real-world clinical experience. What are physicians actually observing after treating large numbers of patients in the real world? Every one of these categories contributes something valuable, but they aren't interchangeable, and learning how to separate them may be one of the greatest takeaways from this entire series. Now, if we get back into that conversation of healing, when most people hear that word, they picture something dramatic, maybe a broken bone knitting back together, a surgical incision or wound closing, or maybe an athlete returning to competition. But healing isn't something your body occasionally does. It's something your body is doing every moment of every single day. Even right now, while you're listening to me in this podcast, your body is replacing worn out cells, repairing microscopic muscle damage, building new collagen, creating tiny new blood vessels, removing damaged proteins, coordinating immune cells, remodeling connective tissue. And all of this is happening without you ever even thinking about it. And healing isn't controlled by one organ, one hormone, or one chemical. It's a conversation, a remarkably sophisticated conversation involving thousands of biological signals communicating with one another every single second of every single day. And that realization changed the way many researchers began thinking about recovery. Instead of trying to overpower the body's natural healing process, they began exploring ways to support it. And I love that perspective because it recognizes something fundamental. Your body already processes extraordinary healing intelligence. The goal isn't necessarily to replace it, it's to understand it and perhaps help it do what it was already designed to do more optimally. So why are peptides generating so much attention? Because it does seem like they're being talked about literally everywhere and by everyone. And recently I was just speaking with a company that specializes in peptide therapies. And one of the comments that they made I found interesting. They said that peptides have been around for over 50 years. People just don't understand them. And I smiled because while there's a lot of truth to that statement, it doesn't really tell the whole story. Scientists have absolutely been studying naturally occurring peptides for decades. Insulin's a peptide, and even GLP-1 wasn't discovered yesterday. Many peptide signaling pathways have been understood for a very long time, but that doesn't automatically mean that every peptide being marketed today for recovery, longevity, performance, or anti-aging has decades of human clinical evidence behind it. Every peptide has its own story. Some stories have been unfolding for decades, others are only just beginning. Some have remarkably encouraging early results, others haven't lived up to the excitement, and some chapters haven't even been written yet. And that's one of the things I love so much about science. It's because it isn't static. It's constantly learning, growing, and evolving. Sometimes early discoveries are confirmed, and sometimes they're refined. Sometimes we uncover benefits nobody even expected, and sometimes we discover limitations or risks that weren't obvious at the beginning. Not because scientists were trying to mislead anyone intentionally, but because medicine continues asking questions. Clinical trials tell us a tremendous amount, but years of real-world experience often teaches us even more. And if we think back to our hormone replacement therapy episodes, for years, millions of women were told hormone therapy was dangerous because of the Women's Health Initiative. But many women suffered unnecessarily for decades after that because the original headlines painted a much simpler and much scarier picture than the actual data supported. As you know, researchers continued studying those results, and then they realized the story was far more complex. Timing mattered, age mattered, the specific hormones mattered, whether a woman still had her uterus or not mattered. The science evolved because our understanding evolved. The COVID pandemic reminds us of yet another important lesson, but from the opposite direction. The underlying mRNA technology in some of the COVID vaccines had been studied for many years before COVID-19. That work helped scientists move much faster on the approval process for those vaccines, faster than most people expected once the pandemic began. Then, after hundreds of millions of people received those vaccines around the world, ongoing safety monitoring identified uncommon side effects such as myocarditis and pericarditis in certain groups that became more apparent with widespread use. But that's exactly how medicine is supposed to work. Research doesn't end when a therapy becomes available. It continues on and on. Scientists continue collecting data, physicians continue reporting observations, regulators continue monitoring safety, recommendations evolve as our knowledge grows. Sometimes that process makes us more confident, and sometimes it makes us more cautious. Both outcomes represent science doing exactly what it was supposed to do, though, Good science isn't about defending old ideas. It's about following the evidence wherever it leads. That's why I don't automatically reject a therapy just because it's new. And I also don't automatically embrace one because early studies looked exciting. I try to stay curious and I try to stay humble, and I try to let the evidence guide the conversation. That's exactly the approach we're talking about through this peptide series. Some of the peptides we're about to discuss have fascinating biological mechanisms. Some have remarkable animal research, some have encouraging early human studies, and some have growing clinical experience. But very few have decades of large-scale human outcomes data. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss them. It also doesn't mean that we should assume we've learned everything there is to learn about them. Every peptide has its own evidence story. Our job isn't to decide how we hope the story ends. Our job is to understand where the story stands today. So now that we have a foundation on this topic established, let's talk about something nobody really explains, and that is, how do these therapies actually make their way to patients? If you've searched online, you've probably noticed there are dozens of companies offering peptides. You're probably seeing really beautiful websites, professional videos, scientific terminology, and some really, honestly, compelling testimonials. You'll also probably see long menus of different peptide options. And at first glance, many of these companies look very impressive and remarkably similar. But beneath the surface, they can actually be very different because some of them are physician-led medical practices, some are telehealth companies, some partner with licensed compounding pharmacies, some are wellness clinics, and unfortunately, some simply sell products over the internet with little or no medical oversight. So it's easy to understand why many consumers feel overwhelmed. And adding to that confusion is the fact that not every peptide exists under the same regulatory framework. People often hear the word peptide and assume they're all treated the same, but they aren't. So to simplify this, I actually find it helpful to think about them as existing in 4 different buckets. Bucket 1 is going to be your FDA-approved peptide medications. These medications have obviously completed the traditional FDA approval process. They've been evaluated for safety, effectiveness, manufacturing consistency, quality, and labeling through extensive regulatory review. Examples would include Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, Ro. But does FDA approval guarantee perfection? Of course it doesn't. And every medication carries risk. But it does mean that we have a much larger body of evidence to help us understand both the benefits and the risks. Then there's bucket number 2, which is going to be your legally compounded peptide medications. This is where things start to get a little confusing because compounded medications are not FDA-approved finished drug products. And hearing that can make many people nervous, but it's important to understand what this statement actually means. It doesn't automatically mean that a compounded medication is unsafe or doesn't work. It simply means it reached patients through a different regulatory pathway than a commercially manufactured FDA-approved drug. Compounding developed because patients aren't a one-size-fits-all. Some people need a different dose, some need a preservative-free formulation, some maybe need a liquid form of the medication, and some are allergic to active ingredients found in commercially available medications. And sometimes there simply just isn't enough of a commercially manufactured version available that meets a patient's needs. So compounding is one piece to the personalized medicine story because it allows physicians to individualize therapy. Think of it like having a talented tailor to make you a custom suit. The goal isn't to prove that every custom suit is better than every suit hanging in a department store. The goal is to create something that fits one individual exceptionally well. Medicine works much in the same way. Personalized doesn't automatically mean superior, it just means customized. And whether customization is the right choice depends on the patient, the quality of the pharmacy, and the evidence supporting the therapy. One more thing I'd like you to remember is that the word compounded tells us almost nothing about the quality of the science behind the therapy. Some compounded medications contain ingredients supported by decades of research, and others don't. The word simply describes how the medication was prepared. It doesn't tell us how much evidence exists for that particular peptide. And then we get into bucket number 3, and this is where things get a little wild because these are products that are in the regulatory gray zone, or what's called the gray market category. And this is where most of today's conversation actually lives. Many of the peptides you've probably heard people talking about, the ones showing up on podcasts, in longevity clinics, sports medicine practices, and regenerative medicine conferences fall into this bucket. Peptides like BPC 157, TB 500, KPV, MOTSI, CMAX, C-Lank, Epidolon, thymosin beta 4, GHK copper, and many others. And these peptides are generating tremendous scientific interest. Many have compelling biological mechanisms. Some have encouraging animal studies. Some have some early clinical human data. And some have years, even decades of lab research behind them. But what you'll also notice is that very few have completed the traditional FDA approval pathway as prescription medications in the United States. So you're probably wondering, if these peptides aren't FDA approved, how are clinics even offering them? And that curiosity is natural, and answering it requires us to address 3 different questions. The first question is, has the FDA approved this peptide as a prescription drug? For BPC 157, the answer is straightforward. No, it has not. There currently is no FDA-approved BPC 157 medication, and the same is true for many of the peptides we're going to discuss throughout this series. Question number 2 is, can a compounding pharmacy legally compound this peptide? Notice that that's a completely different question, because many people assume that if something isn't FDA approved, a compounding pharmacy automatically can't prepare it. But that's not actually how compounding works. Compounding pharmacies don't only compound FDA-approved medications. Under certain circumstances, they're permitted to compound medications for a specific patient from bulk active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs. When doing so, complies with applicable compounding laws, FDA policies, and other regulatory requirements. So while many compounded medications are made from FDA-approved APIs, the final compounded medication itself is generally not FDA-approved. Here's how it works. When we look at FDA-approved drugs versus FDA-approved ingredients, we're asking the following questions. Is it FDA reviewed for safety and efficacy? Is it manufactured identically every time? Is it made under FDA drug manufacturing standards, also known as CGMP? And does it require patient-specific prescriptions? So when we look at FDA-approved manufactured drugs, yes, those are obviously reviewed for safety and efficacy, while compounded medications are not, at least not the finished product. And when we look at manufactured identical delivery every time, yes, that's true when we're looking at FDA-approved manufactured drugs, but not for compounded medications, because these are individualized preparations. And then when we look at whether or not the drug is made under FDA CGMP manufacturing standards, of course, the FDA-approved manufactured drug is, but when it comes to the compounded medication, they're typically not, unless they're made in a 503B outsourcing facility. And then when we look at whether or not a patient-specific prescription is required, that's not normally the case for an FDA-approved manufactured drug, but it is definitely the case for a compounded medication. So when it comes to compounded formulations, what in that formulation is actually FDA-approved? Sometimes the active ingredient has been approved by the FDA in one or more commercially available drugs. The commercial drug containing that ingredient is FDA approved. And the pharmacy then uses pharmaceutical-grade ingredients to prepare a customized dosage, strength, route, or combination that isn't commercially available. For example, if we look at tirzepatide, which is the active ingredient in Mounjaro and Zepbound, those manufactured products are FDA approved. A compounded tirzepatide preparation is not FDA approved, even though it contains pharmaceutical-grade tirzepatide. The same concept applies to many hormones, dermatologic medications, pediatric formulations, veterinary medications, pain creams, and many other compounded prescriptions. So why can pharmacies legally do this? Well, this authority comes from the federal law because medicine recognizes that commercially manufactured drugs cannot meet every patient's needs. Some patients do need different dosage strengths, allergen-free formulations that might be dye-free, preservative-free, lactose-free. Some people need liquid versions, for example, for kids. And some people need topical preparations that aren't readily available in the FDA-approved formulation. Some also need or combinations of medications or even drugs that have been discontinued due to shortages of the drug. This actually happened with GLP-1s, if you remember hearing about that in the news. And many hormone replacement therapies are tailored to an individual patient as well. So a physician writes an individualized prescription, and then the compounding pharmacy prepares the formulation specifically for that patient. And one thing I want you to understand is that historically, compounding was intended to fill an individual patient need, not to mass produce copies of already approved FDA drugs. But recently, medications like GLP-1 agonists like tirzepatide and semaglutide dramatically increased demand, which resulted in shortages of the drug. So many compounding pharmacies legally prepared compounded versions because the FDA's drug shortage policies created an exception for them to do so. As shortages resolved, though, the FDA tightened enforcement regarding when pharmacies could continue compounding copies of commercially available products. That's why you're seeing ongoing legal and regulatory debates about compounded medications, not because compounding itself is illegal, but because the rules governing copies of commercially available drugs are evolving. So when it comes to compounded medications, it's important to understand that they are generally not FDA-approved products. In many cases, however, they are prepared using pharmaceutical-grade active ingredients that are used in FDA-approved medications. Licensed compounding pharmacies are legally allowed to create customized medications for individual patients when a prescriber determines there's a clinical need. What the FDA has not reviewed is that specific compounded formulation for safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing consistency in the same way it reviews a commercially manufactured drug. So in summary, compounding medications are not FDA approved, but these pharmacies are also not operating outside the law. Rather, they're operating under a different regulatory framework than pharmaceutical manufacturers. So when we're talking about the regulatory environment, the rules don't exist in a vacuum, because as medicine and science evolves, the regulations evolve too. The FDA continually evaluates new scientific evidence. It maintains lists of substances that may be appropriate for compounding, others that may not be appropriate, and some that remain under active review, and others where regulators believe additional safety or effectiveness data are still needed. On top of that, FDA guidance changes. Court decisions occasionally influence how regulations are interpreted. Drug shortages sometimes affect what pharmacies are permitted to compound, and scientific discoveries continue. Advisory committees make recommendations. Professional organizations publish new guidance. It's a living system, not a static one. So that's what people mean when they're talking about the evolving regulatory environment. The rules themselves continue developing as the science develops. So I think we're going to continue to see big swings in the way peptides are made available to patients in the months and years to come. And keep in mind, medicine offers advances faster than regulation. Researchers make ongoing and new discoveries. Clinicians begin exploring new therapies and ways to administer them. Scientists publish new evidence and study results. And only then do regulatory agencies begin deciding how those therapies should fit into the healthcare system. That whole process can actually take years and sometimes decades or much longer. And honestly, that's probably appropriate because while innovation is exciting, patient safety is essential. Good regulation tries to balance both. Okay, so now we're moving on to question number 3 in this bucket. Does every compounding pharmacy interpret that evolving landscape exactly the same way? And the answer to that is not necessarily. Some pharmacies actually take an extremely conservative approach. And with that, if there's any uncertainty, they simply won't compound a particular peptide. Others may continue compounding until new FDA guidance becomes available. And then some decide to discontinue offering a peptide after a policy change. Others never offer it to begin with. So it's entirely possible for 2 reputable clinics working with 2 reputable compounding pharmacies to have very different peptide menus. That doesn't automatically mean that one clinic is following the law and the other isn't. More often, this means that they're working with pharmacy partners that have adopted different compliance policies while trying to remain within an evolving regulatory framework. In other words, no one is inventing the rules. Everyone's just trying to interpret and follow them as responsibly as possible while the science and regulations continue to evolve. So I think it's important to remember this. Medicine evolves, regulations evolve, and good healthcare requires both innovation and oversight. But curiosity without critical thinking becomes hype. And critical thinking without curiosity prevents innovation. So we need all 3: curiosity, critical thinking, and oversight. Which leads me to my next question in this bucket. So why doesn't someone just get these peptides FDA approved if they're so promising? Well, there isn't really one universal answer to that question because developing a new medication is an enormous undertaking. So here's kind of how it goes. Before the FDA even considers approving a drug, companies generally need to invest years of research and often hundreds of millions of dollars, and in some cases, billions of dollars. That process usually includes lab studies, animal studies, multiple phases of human clinical trials, manufacturing validation, quality testing, regulatory submissions, long-term follow-up. It's an extraordinary commitment of both time, resources, and money. For some peptides, no company has chosen to pursue that pathway because of all of these criteria. For others, research is still in relatively early stages, and in some cases, regulators still have important questions that need to be answered before approval can even be considered. So when someone says this peptide isn't FDA approved, my next question is always why? Because the answer isn't always the same. Sometimes it reflects limited evidence, sometimes it reflects unanswered safety questions, sometimes it's economics, and sometimes it reflects the fact that no one has invested in the approval process. Those are all very different situations and definitely things to consider. Another thing I'd like you to keep in mind is that FDA approval of a drug isn't simply a declaration that a therapy is good. And lack of FDA approval isn't automatically a declaration that it's bad. Science and regulation answer different questions. Science, of course, asks, does the evidence suggest that this therapy works? The FDA then asks additional questions. Can it be manufactured consistently? Will every batch be identical? Is it stable over time? Do the benefits outweigh the risks for a specific medical condition? Is there enough human evidence to support approval? These are all different questions and they all matter, but they aren't asking exactly the same thing. And again, the absence of FDA approval isn't automatically proof that something does or doesn't work. It just often means there are still important questions waiting to be answered. So why do physicians disagree on topics like this? Why would one physician be super enthusiastic about peptide therapy while another physician won't even touch it? I don't think it's because one doctor cares more than another or doesn't care at all. More often, I think it's that they're likely weighing the available evidence differently. Some physicians place greater emphasis on biological plausibility, early clinical studies, and their own experience treating patients, while others prefer waiting for larger randomized clinical trials and longer-term safety data before incorporating the therapy into their practices. Both approaches come from the same goal, helping patients. They're simply drawing the line at different places on the evidence spectrum. And that's one reason you'll hear thoughtful, well-trained physicians disagree. Science doesn't move forward because everyone thinks the same way. It moves forward because they continue asking better questions. So now, finally, this brings us to our fourth bucket of peptides. This is the one that I'd encourage people to approach with great caution. In your online search for peptides, you might have come across websites selling products labeled not for human consumption, which seems pretty scary. At first glance, those labels seem pretty straightforward, but many of those same products are actually being purchased by individuals who fully intend to inject them into themselves, which raises two obvious questions. Why are people doing this, and how are they getting them? In most cases, they're ordering them directly over the internet. No physician, no medical evaluation, no laboratory testing, no discussion about whether they've been appropriate for that individual, no regulatory oversight, and often no real follow-up. That makes me super uncomfortable, not because I'm opposed to scientific exploration. I'm actually super fascinated by the emerging science, but because injecting something into your body that you just read about online that has absolutely no regulatory oversight is fundamentally different from the other three buckets I just mentioned. When a product is labeled for research only, that generally means it's being sold for lab research, not as an approved medication for patients. That doesn't automatically tell us whether the peptide itself has biological potential, and that's an important consideration before anyone decides to use it personally. Curiosity is healthy. Self-experimentation without understanding what you're injecting deserves a much higher level of caution. Now that we've talked about the different regulatory buckets, if you wanted peptide therapy, where would you even start? Most people don't begin by calling a compounding pharmacy. They begin by finding a healthcare provider who does the full health evaluation, reviews your medical history and assessment of your goals, and then from there they determine whether peptide therapy may or may not be appropriate. If they believe it is, then they'll typically send a prescription to a compounding pharmacy that they trust. Some practices work with one pharmacy, others work with several. Sometimes patients have choices and sometimes they don't. That's one reason I often say choosing the provider may be just as important as choosing the peptide, because the provider often determines where that prescription is ultimately filled. And one quick sidebar about compounding pharmacies that I want to mention, and that's that you may hear terms like 503A or 503B pharmacies. And without getting too deep into the regulatory language, here's the basic idea. A 503A pharmacy compounds medications for individual patients based on a prescription from a licensed healthcare provider. Think of it as customized medicine prepared specifically for one person. A 503B outsourcing facility generally prepares larger batches of compounded medications under additional federal oversight and then can supply healthcare facilities such as hospitals and clinics. The details are a little more complicated than that, but for today's discussion, the important takeaway is this. As I mentioned above, not every compounding pharmacy operates exactly the same way. So how do you evaluate quality with compounding pharmacies? Suppose your provider recommends a peptide. How do you know whether you're receiving a high-quality product? This is where I think patients should feel comfortable asking lots and lots of questions. One of the first questions I'd ask is, who actually manufactured this peptide? Earlier, I mentioned the term API. It stands for active pharmaceutical ingredient. Let's use a vineyard as an analogy. A master winemaker can only make exceptional wine if they begin with exceptional grapes. If the grapes are poor quality, there's only so much the winemaker can do to make that wine taste better. The same principles apply here. A pharmacy may prepare the medication beautifully, but if the starting ingredient isn't manufactured to a high standard, nothing that happens afterward can completely compensate for that. Everything begins with the quality of the active pharmaceutical ingredient. And a high-quality pharmacy purchases pharmaceutical-grade active ingredients, or APIs, from FDA-registered manufacturers and suppliers that provide something called a certificate of analysis. Think of it as a quality control report. A COA can tell us things like, is this actually the peptide listed on the label? How pure is it? How strong is it? How stable is it? Does it have contaminants in it? Does it have heavy metals in it? What batch did it come from? When was it tested? Who performed the testing? And was microbial testing performed if appropriate? Many of the highest quality pharmacies send samples to independent third-party laboratories to verify these results, which is something that I personally appreciate seeing. This separates the good manufacturers from the excellent. And believe it or not, cheaper compounding pharmacies may actually purchase from suppliers that meet only minimum requirements in these areas. So that's something to seriously consider. And if we're talking about injectable peptides, there's two more questions that I'd want answered. First, was it tested for sterility? Remember, when you swallow something, your digestive tract acts as an incredible filtration and defense system. An injection, however, bypasses much of that protection. You're placing something directly into your body, and that's why sterility becomes so important. The second question I'd ask is whether or not it was tested for endotoxins. Endotoxins aren't living bacteria. Think of them more like tiny inflammatory fragments that are left behind after certain bacteria break apart. Even if the bacteria themselves are gone, those fragments can still remain. And if they're injected, they can trigger fever, inflammation, chills, and other unwanted reactions. That's why reputable manufacturers test for both sterility and endotoxins. And one of the best indicators of a reputable compounding pharmacy is accreditation by the Accreditation Commission for Healthcare for Pharmacy Compounding. Accreditation is voluntary, meaning good pharmacies choose to undergo additional inspection. Not every excellent pharmacy, however, has accreditation, but it's certainly a positive sign. And finally, if you really want to do your full due diligence, I would always recommend checking FDA inspection history, State Board of Pharmacy disciplinary actions, warning letters, and recalls. No pharmacy is perfect, of course, but repeated sterility failures, that's a huge red flag. So at the end of the day, transparency is everything. You want a pharmacy, or the provider sending you to that pharmacy, who is willing to answer questions such as, where do your APIs come from? Do you perform third-party potency testing? Do you test every batch? And what are your beyond use states based on? Good pharmacies usually enjoy talking about their quality systems. So if they're not willing to do that, it's probably a sign. So now let's talk about cost. Traditionally, insurances won't typically cover peptides. There are exceptions, of course. Some insurance plans cover certain compounded medications under specific circumstances, but many peptide therapies are considered out-of-pocket expenses. That means the patient's often paying not only for the medication, but also for the physician visits, lab testing, follow-up appointments, and ongoing monitoring. Depending on the peptide in the treatment plan, that investment can range from a few $100s each month to substantially more. That's another reason I believe that patients deserve a clear understanding of why they're taking a therapy before they actually commit to it financially. So throughout this series, I'd like to give you something practical that you can actually use, whether you're evaluating BPC 157, another peptide, or even another emerging therapy altogether. I'm calling it the Serenity and Fire Peptide Checklist. So if someone recommended a peptide for me tomorrow, these are the questions that I'd want answered. First, what's the biological rationale? Why do scientists believe the peptide should work? And does the mechanism make biological sense? 2, what human evidence exists? Are we talking about cell studies, animal studies, small human trials, or large randomized clinical trials? Those are all very different levels of evidence. Third, I want to know, what do we still not know? Where are the unanswered questions? Long-term safety, optimal dosing, who benefits most, who probably shouldn't take it? Understanding uncertainty to me is just as important as understanding what we know. Then fourth, where does the peptide fit within today's regulatory landscape? Is it FDA approved, legally compounded, in a regulatory gray market area, or being strictly sold as a research product? And then fifth, who manufactured it? Who produced the active pharmaceutical ingredient? Which pharmacy prepared it? And is the source reputable? And then finally, how was quality verified? Can they provide a certificate of analysis or a COA? Was it tested for purity? And if it's injectable, was it tested for sterility and endotoxins? And seventh, does the potential benefit outweigh the potential risk for you? Not for an elite athlete, not for someone on social media, but for you. Your health history, your goals, your tolerance for uncertainty, that's what personalized medicine is all about. And then eighth, is this replacing healthy habits or supporting them? No peptide replaces sleep, nutrition, strength training, stress management, or movement. The goal should be to support good health, not replace its foundation. And this is a real issue because I know a lot of people who are taking GLP-1s because they want to look and feel better, but they also don't want to work out or be bothered with having to learn good, healthy eating habits. And the problem with that is that when they discontinue those therapies, if they ever do, in many cases, all of that weight just comes piling right back on. So in addition to the Serenity and Fire checklist, we're going to evaluate every peptide using something I'm calling the promise versus proof scale. This is a 6-category evidence framework that evaluates where the science stands today. This isn't a rating of whether or not I like the peptide, and it's not a recommendation, and it certainly isn't medical advice. It's simply a way of communicating how strong I believe the evidence is today. So for every peptide, I'll score the following 6 categories on a 1 to 10 confidence scale. The first category is going to be biological plausibility or biological foundation. Does the proposed mechanism make scientific sense? Second, preclinical evidence. What do the laboratory and animal studies show? Third, human clinical evidence. What have human studies actually demonstrated? Fourth is clinical experience. What are experienced clinicians observing in practice? And then there's long-term safety evidence. How confident are we in the long-term safety profile? And then finally, overall confidence today. Based on everything we know, how confident should we be today, not 5 years from now, but today? And because we know that every peptide has its own story and that some stories are further along than others, my intention with this promise versus proof scale is not to tell you what to do, but to help you understand where each peptide currently sits on the evidence spectrum. As the science evolves, those numbers may evolve too. And honestly, I hope they do because the expectations for these peptides are really high. So I hope we see them deliver the proof and the promises everyone's hoping for. At a very minimum, the science will evolve one way or another, and that in itself is super exciting. So as we wrap up for today, let's look at what we've learned, because over these last few episodes, we've built not just an understanding of peptides, but a framework for evaluating them. We've talked about how healing actually works, why peptides have generated so much excitement, why the regulatory landscape is more layered than it first appears, how compounding pharmacies fit into this landscape, what questions I believe every patient should ask before considering one of these therapies, how to think about quality, and perhaps most importantly, how to separate biological possibility from scientific evidence and from marketing claims. I hope you know by now that my goal is never going to be to tell you what to believe. It's to help you become a more informed consumer. Someone who can really appreciate exciting new science while still asking thoughtful questions, because I believe that's where the best decisions are made. Starting with our next episode, we're going to be putting everything we've learned into practice. We'll begin evaluating some of the most talked about healing peptides in medicine today. We'll start with BPC 157 because that peptide has become the most synonymous with recovery and tissue healing. From there, we'll explore TB500, KPV, and many other peptides you'll hear about if you spend any time in the world of regenerative medicine, longevity, biohacking, or sports performance. We'll talk about peptides being investigated for tendon and ligament injuries, muscle recovery, gut health, immune regulation, brain health, healthy aging, and much more. And for every peptide we discuss, we'll ask the same questions. What is it? Where did it come from? How is it believed to work? What do the animal research studies show? What human evidence actually exists? What are physicians seeing in clinical practice? And what concerns or unanswered questions still remain? And then we'll put every single peptide through both the promise versus proof scale and the Serenity and Fire peptide checklist. Not to tell you what to think, but to show you how to think about emerging therapies. And by the time we finish this series, my hope is that you'll feel comfortable evaluating almost any peptide, or really almost any new wellness therapy you come across in the future. Because the science will continue evolving, new therapies will continue emerging, the headlines will continue making bold promises, but you'll have something even more valuable, a framework for asking better questions. And in my opinion, that's one of the greatest gifts science can give us. Not certainty, but the ability to think critically, stay curious, and make better decisions as new evidence emerges. As always, thank you so much for listening to Serenity and Fire today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the show, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who wants to better understand the rapidly evolving world of peptides and regenerative medicine. And be sure to tune in next week because in many ways, we've only just begun to explore the excitement that's about to be revealed on this peptide journey. As we close out today's episode, please remember that everything we share on Serenity and Fire is meant for general education and inspiration purposes only. The topics we discuss are not intended to diagnose, treat, or replace personalized medical care, so please always consult with your healthcare provider regarding your individual health concerns, laboratory results, medications, and treatment decisions before trying anything we talk about on the show. Your health is unique and your care should be too. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking better questions, keep investing in your health, and keep balancing serenity with fire. I'm Krista Guidenti, and I'll talk with you more in our next episode. At Panacea Luxury Spa Boutique, we don't just offer traditional spa treatments. We create rituals that relax your mind, restore your health, and rejuvenate your spirit. From biohacking technologies to advanced oncology-trained care, everything we do is designed to help you heal on the deepest level with clean, holistic therapies, products, and amenities that are second to none. And right now, you can experience two of my favorites, our whole body LED light bed or hyperbaric oxygen therapies. And as a thank you for listening, you'll get 10% off your first session when you use the code Serenity10 at booking. What is your panacea? Let us help you find it, because true wellness isn't a quick fix, it's a ritual.